Hi, I'm back with Chapter 11, our last chapter in the book by Dr. Vaughn, Power of Critical Thinking. This particular chapter is going to be our bookend to Chapter 1, Critical Thinking, Immorality, and the Law. We're also going to talk a little bit about building a coherent worldview. Okay, so this will help your paper 3 as well. Anyway, we're looking at today moral arguments, things that we talk about all the time, whether somebody should or shouldn't do something, how we know when things are right or wrong, good or bad, good or evil. And part of that has to do with our worldview. Part of that has to do with how we parse out what counts as good. Remember that very first piece I had you write about for the semester was what makes a person a good person? How do you know if somebody is a good person, capital G kind of good? We're going to talk about morality and things like that today, okay? So I'm going to pop right in with some definitions. A moral statement, got my list over here. A moral statement asserts that an action is right or wrong, moral or immoral, or that something, such as a person or motive, is good or bad or evil. Now you will notice in chapter 11, and really all throughout the book, Dr. Vaughn does not use the word evil. Okay, things are good or bad. And part of that is because when we talk about evil, we're talking mostly about a kind of a spiritual entity, right? And Dr. Vaughn's not having any of that. So he's going to call things good or bad. In your head, you can say evil and move on, but it's okay. A moral statement asserts that an action is right or wrong, and we call that moral or immoral, or that something a person or a motive, usually, is good or bad. Okay. Now, this particular idea is not new to us. We do this all the time. With things as little as, okay, what colors should you use to write on the board, to whether it's right or wrong to use capital punishment, okay? And so all of these moral statements are going to have this emphasis on should, okay? Should be the moral answer to this. Should we do X? Should I do X? And before we start thinking that we're all, moral statements are only things that are, the big picture stuff, it is a moral decision how many classes you take next semester, or how much of your homework you do tonight. Okay, all of those things, because there's a should behind it in your head, it's a moral statement. Okay, it's an aspect of our own ethics. Ethics and morals, really, in philosophy, are about the same thing. But yeah, we're going to go on with that. There are some moral principles that have been gleaned from thousands of years of civilizations and texts and writing and all of that. And you're going to look, I have to put my book down. You're going to look at page 425. Okay. It's the further thought bubble called "Can't We All Just Get Along?" Okay. And this is not an exhaustive list. Okay, there are others, but these are the most common moral principles that we have available to us. And you're going to look at, like I said, page 425, and there's a list on there. Okay, I'm not going to write them all down on the board, but they're in there. And I'm going to talk about them a little bit. First and foremost, personal benefit. Okay, acknowledge the extent to which an action produces beneficial consequences for the individual in question. Okay, so if something furthers my own agenda, if something makes my future better, makes my present better, then that is a moral decision for me to do. Okay, now, of course, it's leaving out all kinds of things. Okay, what does it do to other folks? How does it impact my husband, my family, my friends, my students, whatever? Okay, but the first one on the list is personal benefit. Then we have a list of principles, things that we use to guide our particular ideals. First one, benevolence, help those in need. That's a big deal. A lot of us feel that if we can, we should, whether that's financially or emotionally, encourage people as opposed to discourage them, that kind of thing. The second principle is the principle of harm. Basically, this is do no harm to others. Okay, just because something is personally beneficial for me doesn't mean I should do it, especially if it harms other people. Okay, and that's the big one in the medical field, right? Do no harm. The principle of honesty, do not deceive others. Principle of lawfulness, do not violate the law. Principle of autonomy, okay? This acknowledges that a person's freedom over his or her actions or physical body is moral, okay? We should not impede somebody else's autonomy, not step on somebody else's rights just because we have our own, okay? Principle of justice, a person's right to due process, fair compensation for harm done, and fair distribution of benefits is a universal kind of right. We're going to get to those in just a minute too. But the principle of justice means that we should do this. We should encourage this in our government, in our justice system, that it should be equal and even among all people. So if X person gets 5 years for driving under the influence, so should everybody else. That's kind of how that works. And that's really not how things actually work, but that's the principle of justice. And then there's a list of human rights. Now, if you want to get into more detail about this, go to the United Nations website and look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But here's the basics. Acknowledge a person's right to life, information, privacy, free expression, and safety. Okay? Now, we all know sometimes one of those impedes on another. Okay? Our right to privacy sometimes impedes our ability to be safe. Okay? Our right to be safe sometimes impedes our ability to keep everything private. There are certain things that have shown up as far as ethics go, like our FERPA and HIPAA laws, things that are true about you or me based on education, based on medical records. Those things are considered to be absolutely private. I have access to all of my stuff. You have access to all of your stuff. I don't have access to your stuff unless you give me permission. Same idea, okay? But those are the basics, pretty much universally agreed upon, page 425 for that list. When we look at, we move from moral principles into moral premises, okay? Things that we're going to put to bear on a particular theory or on a particular situation, okay, to discover whether it's asserting a right or a wrong. We're looking at moral premises, and a lot of times we are not encouraged. Lost my little word here. A lot of times we try really hard to kind of make this relative. Okay, this is my truth. Well, we learned back in chapter 4. This doesn't work. Okay, moral relativism doesn't work. But moral premises, basically, we're trying to gauge the truth. And when we do that, we have to examine the support they get in 3 areas. Okay? Okay, so gauging the truth. We need support from 3 things. And the more support we have, the better off we are. 1, other moral premises. 2, we need support from, other moral principles. And They need support from our considered moral judgments. And this is a big deal. And this is the piece here, okay? Other moral premises that agree with them, great. Other moral principles, that list, that agree with this particular moral premise, great. And then we also have to run them through our own moral experience, okay? And our moral experience, a lot of times what we feel or think in the heat of a moment isn't really what we would act upon, okay? And so our considered moral judgments are those things that we find, that we think are credible and real and true when we think or evaluate them carefully and dispassionately. That's the hard part. We try to remove our emotional response to a particular moral issue and look at it from a more objective point of view. Okay, that's not always easy. In fact, it's rarely easy. So these three things are the way we look at our moral premise. Okay. Now, if we don't have support from one of these, then our moral premise is undermined. Doesn't necessarily mean it's not true, but it's undermined. It's not on as strong a ground. Okay. So keep that in mind when we're looking at these moral theories. Now, when we are looking at moral theories, okay, this starts on page 429. We have a few things to think about. Okay, our moral judgments, okay, our moral premises, show up either as actual premises in our argument or as our conclusion. It is right and good to do X, or it is immoral and wrong and bad or evil to do X. Okay, those are moral premises. Okay, remember, premises and conclusion, the only difference is one supports the other. Premises support conclusions. So they all can look the same. Remember our little syllogisms. They tend to have the same structure in all three pieces. Okay, so keep that in mind. When we're looking at moral theories, Dr. Vaughn gives us a list, kind of little paragraphy guys, on page 431. And these moral theories have issues, okay? And not just because scientists or theologians or whatever have problems with them, but because they're internally inconsistent, back in chapter 9. They don't stand up to their own scrutiny, okay? And we talked about these earlier back in chapter 4. Subjective relativism, okay? Moral judgments in this particular case are relative to what each person believes. Well, we still have this problem. If everybody's truth is real and true, but we don't agree with each other, how does that work? Okay? How do we figure out whether something's right and good if we're saying that everything's subjective? Okay, it's all relative. I don't have to worry about it. Well, okay, that sounds nice and equality-based and all that, but really what we're saying is every person is infallible. Well, we know that's not true. We all make mistakes. We all do stupid things. We all do immoral things at one point or another. And so that particular theory can't be true. Okay? It's not true. It's never true. So don't get sucked into that. Same thing with cultural relativism. We can't say that any culture, any society that has ever been or is currently running is infallible. We make mistakes. We make some big mistakes, right? And we don't have to just think of Nazi Germany, although that's the easy one, right? Were the gas chambers moral for them? Absolutely not. Okay. Same thing in this country with slavery, with racism. Absolutely wrong. Cultures are also fallible. They make mistakes, usually huge ones. Ethical egoism. Okay. This is that personal benefit taken to the max. as long as something is good for me, promotes my interests, promotes my agenda, I can do it. Morally fine. Again, I'm not infallible. I make mistakes. Make lots of pretty major ones too. When you're looking at any of these moral aspects, we have a moral criteria of adequacy, and this is at the top of page 433. And it all runs around with consistency. It has to be consistent with our considered moral judgment, okay? Things that we think about and ponder and find credible based on objective truth, okay? Dispassionate. Consistency with our experience of the moral life. If our moral theory cannot make account of the times when we've screwed up, then it doesn't work very well. It's not a very good theory, okay? And lastly, workability in real life situations, okay? Now, I think by now you guys know, I'm a Christian, and I believe that the Bible is true. So there are lots of things that in my moral theory that are, the standards are way up here, okay? Standards for moral behavior are not really workable in our real life situations, okay? Not all the time, not every time. And so what's our response to that supposed to be? Well, in my moral judgment, my moral theory, our role in that is not to judge somebody else, beat them up because they don't believe the same way I did, or they believe the same way I do, but they screwed up. Whatever the sin is, okay, whatever the mess up is, that's not my job. My job as a Christian is to love them well, show them the gospel, show them Christ. All of those things are workable in real life. I don't have any problem with any kind of sin. Now, there are certain repercussions, especially to things that society and Christianity all find immoral. Things like adultery, things like murder, child abuse, all those kinds of things are universally abhorrent, and they have repercussions. Now, there's a lot of things that get wrapped up in that theology-wise, but the repercussions are not my job to deal out. My job as a Christian is to love this person and help them see the error of their ways so that they can be reconciled and make that restitution. That's what I hope happens when I mess things up. I hope somebody loves me enough to kind of guide me back onto the right way of doing things. And that's part of our jobs as human beings in general, not just Christians. And I think part of what this chapter really gets at is looking at the way people view the world and trying to work with them in order to make the world a better place. Okay, that's a big deal, at least in my mind. So our moral theories have to go through that moral criteria of adequacy. There are a lot of ways we can look at that, okay? Now, Dr. Vaughn gives us pages and pages of stuff on two particular moral theories. One is traditional utilitarianism, and utilitarianism is basically, short and sweet, the whatever decision does the most good for the most folks, okay? So if you're in the minority, it's not so good for you. But whatever does the most good for the most folks, that's what we should pursue. Kantian ethics, Immanuel Kant, theologian, philosopher, he says basically act only on that maxim, okay, that ideal, through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So the only things that are moral for me to do, for you to do, are things that are moral for everyone to do. Okay? And those are the only things we can count. Now, there are some things that fit really well into that, okay, like murder. Nobody should murder another person. We can say that out loud. That's not so bad. There are lots of other little things, though, that you can't quite put in that thing. Now, Kant is basically the other end of the spectrum from relativism. He says if it's true, it's always true, regardless. Okay? We like that. Makes life easy for us. It's that whole workable in everyday life that gets us in trouble. But there's a really good explanations in the book here up until page 438, gets us to the end of the moral section of this chapter. Legal reasoning only takes up about 3 pages, actually 2 pages. And basically what Dr. Vaughn is getting at is we can boil down all of legal reasoning into 2 pieces. One is precedent and one is inference, okay? Precedent, we're talking about analogy. Because the outcome of cases that look like this have ended this way, this one should too. Okay, it's where we get most of our criminal law from, and a lot of civil law as well. But because this particular crime is expected to look like this, okay, we have a case of breaking and entering. We know we have to look for evidence of forced entry, okay, or it's not breaking. We also have to look for evidence that the person was actually in the house or in the business and did something negative there. Usually it means they took something. Sometimes it just means they messed things up, vandalism. But breaking and entering has certain aspects to it that show up in every crime, and that's precedent. Okay, we've looked at this way. It always looks like this. Now, okay, which door, which window? The specifics are different, but you have to have this forced entry. You have to have evidence that the person was actually in the domicile, in the house, in the business, and then you can go on from there. But that's that particular charge. Okay, then you get things like vandalism and theft. Okay, different pieces that way. So legal reasoning, precedent goes with analogy. Inference goes with causation. Okay, a lot of times when we're looking at even manslaughter cases, say somebody was driving under the influence, they ran into somebody else's car and that person died. Did they murder that person? Well, they killed them, but murder implies intent. Manslaughter means you were responsible, but you didn't mean to. Okay, there's part of that. And we can get into all kinds of nuances with that. But when we're looking at causation, when we're looking at inference, did this particular action actually cause something else to happen, something negative to happen, whether it's somebody's injury or death or damage to property, that kind of stuff. If you're negligent, okay, that kind of picks things up a bit. This is not the first time you've been in a DWI. A little bit more intentional there. But when we're looking at legal reasoning, we are looking at an if-then. Okay, we're looking at inference, we're looking at precedence. And that's pretty much the deal. Okay. The last piece, and this is probably the most important part of the book for us to understand really how to use critical thinking, how we use it. Our worldviews are the way we see the world, the way things work for us in the world, and we need to be careful, okay? The worldview is a massive intellectual construct with many elements, okay? That philosophy of life, okay, 3 little words, really huge idea here. And we need to work at understanding how we think about the world and how we use that in our ethical decisions so that we can be more and more consistent as we go along, okay? Now, there are lots of things that tend to conflict, not necessarily contradict, but how we think about God and the universe tend to butt heads with each other, okay? How we think of our moral theory can conflict with our view of human freedom. Okay? Do we think every person has the right to act in their own best interest? Well, that sounds good. What if your best interest steps on my right to privacy, information, life? Things get weird, right? Our theory about the existence of God can conflict with our scientific theory about the nature of the universe. Our theory about the mind can be in conflict with theories of personal survival after death. Okay. Our brains, our thoughts, our ideas are what makes us individual. Well, what happens when your brain dies? Some of us believe that there's a life after this one. What happens to that brain stuff? Okay. Not easy to reconcile. But every statement, every theory, every worldview is fair game to critical thinking. Okay? Everything we do, everything we think, everything we say, we can run it through that gauntlet of criteria of adequacy, truth, structure, all of those things. And the most important thing we can do that with is our own worldview, how we see the world, how we interact with the world. And the very last sentence in the book, before you get to all the end stuff, our worldviews are far too important not to subject them to intelligent, reasoned reflection. Goes back to that Socrates quote, the unexamined life is not worth living. Our worldviews require us to examine them, make sure that we're doing what we think we're doing. We're making decisions that we think are the right ones because these particular ideals, these particular principles are true for us. And I'm not saying for us as a relativism thing, but this is how we view the world. Are we correct? Are people who look differently than us worse than us? No, absolutely not. Do we know people who we would rather not be in the same room with? Well, yeah. Can we make assumptions about other folks who look like them? No, that's not enough information to go on. Remember, when we're looking at samples and tests, we have to think about what's our endpoint. How should we behave? What's our moral answer? What's our moral center? And I think Dr. Vaughn has given us a lot to think about and a lot to work with, a lot of strategies to work with, and I hope you have found at least some of these useful and reasonable, and that it will help you inform your life as you go along. So that's the end of the book. Well, you have homework to do, but follow directions. Everything will be okay.